A judge in Texas just ruled that federal laws on home distillation, in other words, making your own moonshine, vodka, whiskey, and more, are unconstitutional. Is this real? Does this change anything? And can you legally distill at home now? So, one, yes, this is the real deal, folks. Sort of. I've seen a lot of misinformation on this topic over the years, but this actually looks legit. I'm going to look at this case, but before I get started, I'm going to say that there are some positives here, but there are also a couple of big negatives. There are some big problems with this decision in terms of it actually changed anything for most hobby distillers. And I should mention that I'm not a lawyer, but I do feel fairly qualified to weigh in on this because I own a company that sells distillation equipment, copper stills, stainless steel stills, basically everything you would need to make your own spirits at home if that were legal. And I've been following this kind of stuff for a very long time. On its face value, this decision is definitely a huge deal. I've never seen anything like this happen before. Nothing even as close to as significant as this. Essentially, if you guys in Texas managed to convince a federal judge that 150-year-old federal statutes that regulate home distilling, which were enacted in 1868, 3 years after the Civil War ended, that these statutes exceed congressional power. Again, there are problems with this ruling, and I'll explain that, but nevertheless, this is pretty crazy. So the plaintiffs in the case are members of the Hobby Distillers Association, which is an organization I'm pretty sure I've donated to in the past. I believe we were even members at one point. This was years ago. I didn't even know they were still active. The defendant in the case is the Alcohol, Tobacco, Tax and Trade Bureau, otherwise known as the TTB. If you're in the alcohol industry, you'll be familiar with that acronym. But people often incorrectly assume that the ATF is the primary entity that regulates home distilling, which is not exactly true. They are involved somewhat, but not like people think they are. And I'll explain that later as well. But there's an important distinction between the two here. Anyway, the plaintiffs claim that the ban on home distilling isn't a proper use of Congress's authority, one of which is to tax people, products, corporations, and more in the United States to generate money for the common defense and general welfare of the country. So why is the Hobby Distillers Association claiming that this is not a proper use of tax authority? Well, when you read the regulations on distilling, they're very much focused on restricting distillation activity in a way that supports and protects the government's ability to collect taxes on distilled spirits. What the rules ultimately prohibit are the distillation and distribution of untaxed spirits. So these aren't regulations meant to protect public health or the environment or something like that. These regulations, as written, only exist to assist with the generation of tax revenue. So the plaintiffs are saying, okay, sure, Congress has the power to tax. So on its face, this kind of makes sense, but prohibiting distillation at home doesn't actually prevent the government from collecting taxes on commercially produced spirits. It's just a restriction on distilling at home. Now, I imagine that 150 years ago, this was a potentially effective means of generating revenue because home distilleries and unlicensed distilleries, small-scale distilleries, were probably very prevalent. And I imagine that collecting taxes from licensed distilleries at that time was no small feat either. But that was 150 years ago. A lot of things have changed since then. The same rules today don't do the same thing that they did then. They don't have the same meaning and impact that they did then. Another point brought up by the plaintiffs is that home distillation rules have been unevenly applied. Commercially produced beer and wine are subject to federal excise tax, but beer and wine are legal to make at home as of 1979. Commercially produced tobacco is subject to a federal excise tax, yet it's legal to grow and use your own tobacco at home. Fuel is subject to excise tax, but you can make your own fuel alcohol at home with the proper permits. There's a mechanism allowing people to make their own fuel at home as well. But for some reason, spirits have been excluded from these freedoms. So there's definitely an imbalance here. which is not too hard to prove. And why is this? Alcohol isn't listed as a controlled substance, and the rules make no mention of health or safety concerns. Now, that's not to say there weren't health and safety concerns in 1865 when these rules were created. That could have been on the minds of the people who wrote the legislation, although if it was, those thoughts didn't translate to paper. The rules on home distillation, again, are clearly focused on the collection of taxes. So anyway, in the ruling, Judge Pittman cited the following. Congress's authority under the taxing power is limited to requiring an individual to pay money into the federal treasury. No more. If a tax is properly paid, the government has no power to compel or punish individuals subject to it. He also wrote that while prohibiting the possession of an at-home still meant to distill beverage alcohol might be convenient to protect tax revenue on spirits, it's not a sufficiently clear corollary to the positive power of laying and collecting taxes. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I believe what's being said here is that yes, government bans on home distillation make it easier to collect taxes on alcohol, but a ban is not an obvious extension of the government's constitutional authority to tax. It's more of a practical measure than a constitutionally mandated one. The federal government essentially said that this is within our power to tax, and the judge basically responded with,
well, that's just like your opinion, man.
So, does this actually change anything? In my opinion, and I bet the plaintiffs in this case would probably agree, there is a pretty big flaw that prevents this ruling from actually changing anything right now. It's the fact that state and local laws are currently more significant from a practical standpoint than federal rules regarding home distillation. The federal government, as far as I know, doesn't really enforce home distillation laws. They're definitely breathing down the neck of commercial distillers, but for the most part, they leave home distillers alone. Home distillation used to be tightly regulated by the ATF, and they still do provide on-the-ground support from time to time. The ATF seems to be focused on other stuff. So the responsibility for the regulation of alcohol and home distillation now falls mostly on the TTB, which will pay lip service to the fact that home distillation is illegal. They state so clearly on their website, but they generally are only providing on-the-ground enforcement for the rules created for legal distilleries. What you almost always see in terms of people getting in trouble for home distillation is a state or a local government agency conducting an investigation and bringing charges against people. And by the way, we read up on these stories. We kind of keep tabs on this loosely. And it's almost never a situation where someone gets in trouble for distilling only. The headline is always something like illegal meth operation taken down, guns seized, drugs seized. Oh, and there was some moonshine and a moonshine still as well. Moonshine is almost always secondary. Another favorite, actually, and this is another quite common occurrence, is a domestic dispute situation where the spouse mentions the still out in the shed when the cops show up at 2 a.m. due to an argument over who drank the last Mountain Dew Baja Blast in the refrigerator.
These are professionalologists!
I gave him money to go to the food circus and get the macaroni and cheese. So what did he do?
Cleaned up and I'm good.
What's that?
Oh, Ronnie.
Okay, let me explain it.
That actually happens quite a bit. Not necessarily the Baja Blast thing, but the domestic dispute thing where the spouse rats their husband out generally for having a still during an argument that involves the police. So you rarely see instances of the federal government showing up at the home of true home distillation hobbyists who are only engaging in that activity. If you're a home distillation hobbyist and the federal government showed up at your place, please leave a comment below. But we haven't seen or heard of a lot of that. So number 3, is home distilling legal now? So even though federal law might change, state and local laws need to change as well. That said, this decision, if it holds up, is a very big deal because local and state governments often defer to federal rules on this topic. And if there are none, that opens the door for a lot of change in a short amount of time, literally by default in some situations. The judge issued his ruling on July 10th and is giving the government 14 days to respond, which I'm sure they will. In the meantime, distilling is still illegal at the federal level and in 48 of the 50 states at the state level. Missouri and now West Virginia make exceptions for home distillation. It is legal in those states at the state level. If you think this ruling will stand or you think it will get struck down, leave us a comment, vote one way or another in the comment section. If you want to check out some sweet distillation equipment, go to our website, clawhammersupply.com. And if you want to donate money to the Hobby Distillers Association for the awesome work that they're doing, I will leave a link below. Thanks for watching.